It started with the sound of angry footsteps crunching against gravel and the slam of car doors that echoed across the quiet lakeside morning. The birds stopped singing, the mist over the water seemed to freeze in place, and Cashin Holt, who had been pouring coffee into a chipped mug, looked out the window of his cabin just in time to see a parade of suited figures stomping up his path like they were preparing to raid an enemy fortress. They carried folders, clipboards, and a strange kind of arrogance that felt heavier than any weapon. And at the front of this march was a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper voice calling out before she even reached the porch that he was in violation of a dozen rules. The strange part was, Cashin had never signed a single HOA document in his life. He set down his mug, not in a hurry, not in panic, but with a kind of calm that only made the approaching crowd angrier. Outside, the HOA board members arranged themselves like an invading army, papers flapping in the breeze. The president, Letitia Vorn, was tall and thin with hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt. She had the look of someone who had spent too much time policing lawns and measuring paint shades, and she seemed delighted to have found a new target. Her vice president, a broad man named Albin Cray, carried a tape measure as if ready to strike down violations on the spot. Behind them were two more members, including a young woman who seemed to be taking notes for sport. Cashin opened the cabin door and leaned against the frame, studying them with the faintest of smiles. He was dressed in worn jeans, a plain shirt, and boots that looked older than the cabin itself. His calm was disarming, his silence louder than their noise. Letitia raised her voice, accusing him of moving into the cabin without HOA approval, of ignoring bylaws that had been in place for decades, of upsetting the harmony of their community. Her words spilled out in a rehearsed rhythm, each accusation sharper than the last. Cashin finally spoke, his voice steady and low, asking her one simple question. Who gave her the authority to storm his property without an invitation? The question stopped them for a moment, like a sudden gust of wind had knocked the air out of their lungs. Albin quickly recovered, pulling out his tape measure and declaring that the porch railing was an inch too high, the mailbox not uniform with the rest of the neighborhood. Cashin only lifted his brow, almost amused, and asked if they had ever noticed that his cabin was the only structure on this side of Ashwood Lake. That small truth seemed to hang in the morning air, unnoticed until he said it aloud. The board members muttered among themselves, uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. Letitia announced that fines would begin immediately, that paperwork would be sent, that legal action was an option. Her voice shook slightly when she said legal action, and Cashin caught it. He stepped off his porch, his boots crunching against the dirt path, and walked right past her to stand at the edge of the lake. His gaze stretched across the water, calm and almost distant, before he finally spoke again. He said quietly but clearly that people often mistake possession of a rulebook for actual power. And when he turned to look at them, his eyes carried a weight none of them expected. For the first time, Letitia faltered. The young woman with the notepad glanced around nervously, as if realizing this confrontation was not unfolding the way she had expected. Albin grumbled something about calling the sheriff, but even he did not move. Cashin walked back to his porch, picked up his mug, and told them they had 5 minutes to leave his property before he considered it trespassing. His tone was not loud, not threatening, but there was something final in it that made their stomachs twist. They argued, of course. They hissed and whispered, saying he had no authority to speak that way, that the HOA was the law here. Cashin simply sat back on his porch chair, sipping his coffee and watching them as if they were characters in a play he had already seen. He did not explain who he was or why he was there. He gave them nothing but silence and the occasional amused look. That silence unnerved them more than any shouting could have. Finally, Letitia declared that this was only the beginning, that they would be back with enforcement, that no one defied the HOA. She spun around and marched down the path, her heels stabbing the dirt with each step. The others followed, muttering their frustration, trying to hide their unease. The last one to leave was the young note-taker, who lingered for a moment, glancing back at Cashin as if she knew there was more to this man than he let on. Then she hurried after the rest. When the sound of engines faded and the lake returned to silence, Cashin leaned back in his chair and finally allowed himself a quiet laugh. not because their threats amused him but because of how little they understood. They had stormed into his life with their rules and demands, never realizing that the land beneath their own expensive homes belonged to him. They thought him a newcomer, a trespasser, a man to be bullied into submission, but the truth was far larger and far more dangerous for them than they could possibly imagine. As the mist lifted from the water and the sun broke through the trees, Cashin knew the storm was only beginning. They would come again, louder and angrier, believing they held the upper hand. They would press fines, papers, and empty threats, and each time, their arrogance would blind them to the reality waiting just beneath the surface. Cashin sipped his coffee, smiled faintly, and whispered to himself that sometimes the best way to deal with invaders is to let them believe they are winning. Because soon enough, the moment would come when they learned that the man they tried to drive out was in fact the landlord of everything they claimed to control. The morning after the confrontation at the cabin, the lake was calm, but the neighborhood was already buzzing with whispers and stories that grew more dramatic each time they were told. Letitia Vorn had wasted no time in gathering the HOA board for an emergency meeting at her large glass-fronted house that looked more like a courthouse than a home. She sat at the head of the table with her arms crossed tightly over her chest and her eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. Albin Cray was on one side, still clutching his tape measure like a soldier holding a weapon, while the others whispered nervously about the strange man in the cabin. They described him as defiant, arrogant, and possibly dangerous because he had not bowed down to their authority. Letitia tapped the table and declared that they had to make an example out of him before anyone else in the neighborhood began questioning their rules. The board members nodded, but one of them voiced hesitation, saying that the cabin had never really been part of the original HOA design, and that the bylaws were old and confusing when it came to property lines. Letitia snapped at her, saying that the details did not matter and what mattered was control. She claimed that if they let one outsider slip through without punishment, then the entire structure of their community would collapse. Albin suggested that they start with heavy fines and maybe even arrange an inspection to dig up violations that would give them leverage. Letitia smiled coldly and agreed, but her mind was already moving faster than that. She wanted a battle. She wanted to show everyone that the HOA was not to be challenged. While they plotted their moves, Cashin Holt sat by the lake, reading through a thick folder of old deeds and contracts he had collected years before. The papers were yellow with age, some stamped with seals from the county, some signed by men long gone. He studied them with quiet patience because every line, every detail mattered. These documents were not only proof of ownership but keys to power that no one around him suspected. Cashin had bought not only the cabin but large pieces of land surrounding it over time, always in silence, always through obscure transactions that drew little attention. He preferred shadows to noise and patience to bragging. To him, the HOA was not a true threat but more of an irritation, like gnats buzzing too close to his face. Still, he knew that their arrogance could not be ignored forever. Later that day, he walked into the small-town library where the records of Ashwood Lake were kept in dusty filing cabinets that no one visited anymore. The librarian, a gentle older man named Corin Marrow, greeted him with surprise because few residents cared about history or land documents. Cashin asked for access to the older surveys and maps, and Corin obliged, handing over rolled-up parchment that smelled of mildew and time. As Cashin spread them out across a long wooden table, he traced the property lines with his finger, noting every mistake, every gap, every forgotten clause that gave him authority over land that others believed belonged to the HOA. He found quiet satisfaction in seeing just how fragile their foundation truly was. As he worked, a voice interrupted him from the next table. It was Soren Pike, a wiry man with messy hair, who wore clothes that looked like he had wrestled a storm and lost. He lived near the edge of the lake in a crooked little house and was known as the eccentric of the community. He grinned at Cashin with sharp teeth and leaned over the table to peek at the maps. He said he had seen the HOA march up to the cabin the day before, and he admitted with a laugh that he enjoyed every second of their frustration. He despised the board, especially Letitia, who had once tried to fine him for having too many wind chimes on his porch. Soren told Cashin that the HOA thrived on fear, and that most of the neighbors secretly hated them but never had the courage to stand up. He then asked what Cashin planned to do. Cashin only smiled and said he was just reading history. That night, in her large home, Letitia drafted letters filled with threats and fines. She worded them carefully, making sure each one sounded official and merciless. She believed strongly in the theater of authority where paper and ink could scare people into submission. She planned to send these letters not only to Cashin but to his neighbors as well so that they would see what happened to anyone who defied her. She wanted the entire lake to tremble at the mention of the HOA. What she did not realize was that her foundation was about to crumble faster than she could imagine. The next day the letters arrived in Cashin's mailbox, but instead of tearing them open with dread, he carried them inside, set them on the table, and left them untouched while he cooked breakfast. Soren showed up later with his usual reckless energy, waving his own letter in the air, and shouting about the absurd fine for having a canoe tied too loosely to his dock. He slammed the paper down and declared that the board had gone mad. Cashin chuckled quietly and finally opened his own envelope, reading it line by line. His eyes scanned the words carefully, and when he finished he set it down without a flicker of worry. Soren demanded to know why he was not furious, but Cashin explained simply that rules only mattered when they were backed by real authority, and what the HOA had was paper thin. Meanwhile, Letitia held another meeting, this time with her closest allies only. She told them that if Cashin did not respond they would escalate further, perhaps even bring in county enforcement or private security to make him comply. Albin liked the idea of calling in uniforms and flashing badges because intimidation worked better with a show of force. Letitia agreed and began drafting another plan, one that would bring more drama and spectacle to the fight. She pictured Cashin being dragged out of his cabin while the neighbors watched and whispered about how the HOA always won. But in the shadows of her ambition, cracks were already forming. One of the younger board members began to doubt the path they were taking. She remembered the way Cashin had looked at them during the first confrontation, calm and unshaken, as if he held a secret none of them could see. She worried that pushing him too hard would backfire in ways they were not prepared for. Yet her voice was drowned out by Letitia's certainty and Albin's gruff support. Back at the cabin, Cashin sat at his desk, writing quietly in a leather notebook. He wrote not about fear but about patience and timing. He understood that sometimes the best battles were the ones fought without raising a sword or shouting a threat. He looked out over the lake and saw the reflection of the sky slowly darkening into night, and he knew that soon enough the HOA would return louder and angrier, convinced that they were in control. And when they did, he would be ready to show them just how little control they actually had. The morning came with heavy clouds gathering over Ashwood Lake, and the air felt tense as if the sky itself knew trouble was coming. Cashin Holt rose early and moved through his cabin with quiet steps, making coffee and sitting by the window where he could see the path leading to his porch. He knew they would return because people like Letitia Vorn and her board were never satisfied with one show of force. They needed control like others needed air, and the moment someone refused to bow down they became restless and angry. Cashin watched the lake for a long time, listening to the creak of the trees in the wind until the sound of engines broke the silence again. Several cars pulled up, and this time, instead of only board members, there were men in dark uniforms stepping out with the stiff movements of hired security. They wore badges that looked official at a glance, but the details were wrong, and Cashin could tell immediately they were not true officers but hired muscle brought in to scare him. Letitia walked at the front, her heels striking the ground with exaggerated authority, as she announced loudly that Cashin was in violation of multiple bylaws, and that enforcement had arrived to make sure order was restored. Albin Cray was behind her, smirking with the tape measure hanging from his pocket, as though he were proud of what was about to happen. The two uniformed men moved toward the porch, their hands resting on their belts as if ready to drag Cashin out. Cashin stood slowly and stepped outside, closing the cabin door behind him. He looked at them all with calm eyes and asked them again what authority they had to enter his property. One of the guards raised his chin and declared they were here on orders from the HOA, but Cashin only smiled faintly and told them HOA orders did not carry the weight of law. His voice was quiet but steady, and that unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Letitia tried to push forward, waving her papers in his face, demanding that he leave the cabin until inspections were done. Cashin did not move, and instead he asked the two men in uniforms if they had any legal documents signed by the county or any sheriff's department authorizing their actions. They looked at each other and then back at Letitia, who quickly snapped that she was the authority here. Cashin stepped closer, his boots heavy against the wood of the porch, and told them very clearly that if they stepped 1 foot into his cabin without proper authority, he would consider it trespassing and deal with it accordingly. There was something in his tone, a steel edge beneath the calm, that made even the hired men hesitate. The neighbors had begun to gather by then, curious about the noise and the unusual presence of uniforms at the lake. They stood in clusters whispering as the scene unfolded. Some looked worried, others excited, as if watching a show they had long hoped someone would stage against the board. Soren Pike arrived with his usual energy, laughing loud enough for everyone to hear as he shouted to Letitia that she had finally gone too far. His laughter carried over the water, making the entire situation feel both dangerous and absurd. The guards shifted uncomfortably as they realized they were being watched by a growing crowd. Letitia's anger flared, and she ordered them to proceed, but the hesitation in their movements showed that Cashin's words had already cut into their confidence. Cashin turned to the neighbors, his voice calm, as he told them he respected law and order, but only when it came from the proper place, not from self-appointed enforcers who believed they could twist rules into weapons. The neighbors murmured in agreement, some even nodding at his courage. For the first time, the HOA board felt the ground beneath their feet slipping as their authority cracked under the weight of public doubt. Albin tried to save the moment by demanding Cashin show proof of ownership and compliance, but Cashin only looked at him steadily before answering that ownership would reveal itself soon enough. He walked back to his chair on the porch, sat down, and sipped his coffee as though the entire drama before him was nothing more than a brief interruption to his morning. The casualness of his movements infuriated Letitia, who turned red with rage. She shouted threats of lawsuits, massive fines, and court dates, but the more she raged, the calmer Cashin seemed to become. The contrast was striking, and the neighbors began whispering louder, now siding with him in spirit, even if they were not yet brave enough to speak out fully. The security men finally stepped back, muttering something about not being paid enough for this kind of mess. Letitia screamed at them to do their jobs, but they ignored her, returning to their vehicle and driving away, leaving the board exposed and humiliated in front of the community. Soren cheered loudly, clapping his hands together and shouting that the empire of the HOA had just cracked. Letitia glared at him, but he only grinned wider, leaning on a fence post with obvious delight. When the board finally stormed away, Cashin sat quietly until the crowd dispersed. Later that evening, Soren came to the cabin and told him how the neighbors were beginning to whisper in new tones. They were tired of Letitia's iron grip, and for the first time they had seen someone stand against her without fear. Cashin listened carefully but did not comment much. He knew this was only the beginning and that Letitia would not stop until she had either destroyed him or destroyed herself trying. That night, as the storm clouds broke into rain, Cashin sat with his old documents, once again studying the fine print. He remembered why he had bought the land in silence years ago after leaving the city behind. He had once been a man deeply involved in deals and betrayals that had cost him dearly. The cabin was supposed to be his retreat, his place of peace, but fate had thrown him into conflict once more. He traced the signatures and seals in the documents, thinking of the irony that the very people who now tried to remove him lived on land that he controlled without their knowledge. He smiled faintly at the thought, not with cruelty, but with patience, knowing the moment of revelation would come soon. Meanwhile, Letitia held another late night meeting, furious at the embarrassment she had suffered. She swore that Cashin was dangerous, manipulative, and needed to be removed before he undermined everything they had built. Albin agreed, saying they should contact county officials, though even he sounded less certain after seeing the hesitation of the security men. Another board member suggested they gather evidence and file a lawsuit, but Letitia wanted something faster, something that would crush Cashin before he gained more support from the neighbors. She could feel her power slipping, and it terrified her. As another storm brewed across the horizon, Cashin closed his documents and placed them back in the leather case. He stood on his porch, watching the ripples across the water, and whispered to himself that the game was shifting quickly. The board had tried intimidation and failed, and their next move would be desperate. He could feel it in the air, like the pressure before lightning strikes. The lake was quiet, but he knew the loudest storm was still to come. The storm came not with thunder and lightning, but with paper and words. Letitia Vorn marched through the neighborhood, handing out flyers and warnings that spoke of danger and rebellion. She told the neighbors that Cashin Holt was a threat to their way of life and that he planned to turn the lake into something unrecognizable. Her voice was sharp, her gestures dramatic, and her eyes filled with fury. Albin Cray followed behind her, scowling at anyone who dared to look doubtful as he waved his tape measure like a sword. The board had decided on one last strike, a desperate attempt to paint Cashin as an intruder before the community turned completely against them. But the neighbors no longer looked at them with respect. Many only nodded politely, then folded the papers away without a word, while others dropped them into trash bins as soon as Letitia's back was turned. The fear that once gave the HOA power was fading fast, and they did not know how to stop it. At the cabin, Cashin prepared himself not with speeches or threats but with facts. He laid out his collection of deeds and contracts across his wooden table, arranging them carefully so that every line could be read clearly. He had decided that the time for silence was over. The board had tried intimidation and failed. They had tried hired muscle and failed. Now they had chosen lies. The truth would be his answer, and the truth was sharper than anything they could imagine. Soren Pike arrived as the sun began to set, carrying a bottle of cheap wine and his usual mischievous grin. He sat at the table looking at the documents and let out a long whistle. He told Cashin that he had always known there was something different about him, but he had not guessed it was this. Cashin only smiled faintly and said the board had built their empire on sand, and soon enough everyone would see how easily it washed away. Soren raised his bottle and laughed, saying he could not wait for the show. The next evening Letitia called for a special community meeting in the large hall near the center of the neighborhood. She wanted a spectacle, and she wanted Cashin humiliated in front of everyone. The hall filled quickly with neighbors whispering nervously. Some were curious, others were excited, but almost all of them were tired of the endless rules and punishments the board had enforced for years. Letitia stood at the front, her voice loud and theatrical, as she accused Cashin of being a fraud, of breaking laws, of undermining the community. Albin held up photos of the cabin and shouted about violations from porch height to mailbox placement. The other board members nodded along, but their eyes betrayed unease. Cashin waited quietly until she finished. Then he stood slowly and walked to the front, carrying the folder of papers under his arm. His steps were calm, his eyes steady, and his voice even when he spoke. He did not raise his tone or slam his fist for drama. He simply laid the documents out on the table in front of the crowd. He explained that years ago, when land along Ashwood Lake was being divided, he had bought large portions through auctions and silent sales. He showed signature stamps and seals, all perfectly legal and binding. He explained that the HOA had never actually owned the land beneath many of their homes, and that their authority existed only because no one had bothered to check. His words landed like stones dropped into water, sending ripples of shock through the hall. Letitia laughed harshly and called him a liar, but the neighbors pressed closer to see the documents for themselves. Corin Marrow, the librarian, stood up and confirmed that he had seen Cashin studying these very records, and that they matched the old surveys exactly. Murmurs spread through the hall, some filled with disbelief, others with sudden realization. One man asked loudly if it was true that his home stood on Cashin's property. Cashin looked at him calmly and nodded. Another woman shouted in frustration, asking if that meant all the fines she had paid over the years were nothing more than intimidation. Cashin did not answer directly, but his silence told them enough. Albin tried to shout over the noise, claiming it was all forged, but his voice was drowned out by the rising anger of the crowd. Letitia slammed her hand on the table and demanded order, but the more she shouted, the more people ignored her. Finally Cashin raised his hand and the room fell quiet. He told them plainly that he did not come to the lake to fight or to rule, but to live in peace. He said he had allowed the HOA to operate because it kept him free from attention and he had no need for conflict. But when they stormed his home, when they tried to drag him out with fake authority, they forced him to reveal the truth. He told them he would not destroy their homes, he would not tear down their lives, but he would no longer allow the board to abuse them. His voice was steady, his eyes calm, and the weight of his words pressed down on everyone in the room. Letitia screamed that he was manipulating them, that he wanted to take everything from them, but even her allies on the board shifted uncomfortably. One younger member stood and announced she could no longer support the lies. She admitted that she had doubts from the beginning and that what Cashin presented was undeniable. The fracture in the board appeared instantly, and the crowd erupted again, this time with shouts demanding Letitia step down. She turned pale but still tried to argue, only to be drowned out by the voices of the very people she once controlled. Cashin picked up his folder and turned to leave, but before he stepped out he told the room that change was their choice. He said he had no desire to play tyrant as they had done, but he would protect what was his, and he would no longer tolerate false authority. Then he walked out into the night, leaving the neighbors buzzing with anger, confusion, and excitement. Soren followed him out, still grinning wildly. He told Cashin that the look on Letitia's face when the truth came out would be something he would remember until his last breath. Cashin only smiled faintly and said the real work was only beginning. For although the truth was revealed and the board shaken, he knew Letitia was not finished. People like her did not give up power easily, and desperation often drove them to reckless acts. Back in her large home, Letitia raged like a storm, smashing papers from her desk and shouting at Albin that they could not allow this man to destroy them. Albin looked weary but still swore he would stand with her, though his voice carried little conviction. Letitia paced the room, her mind racing for a way to twist the situation back into her favor. She thought of lawsuits, of calling in officials, of painting Cashin as dangerous in the eyes of the county. She refused to accept that her empire of control had fallen in one night. Cashin returned to his cabin and sat quietly on the porch watching the stars above the lake. He knew the battle was not over, but he felt the shift in the air. The neighbors no longer looked at him as an intruder. Some looked at him with respect, others with relief. The fear that had fed the HOA for so long was breaking apart, and in its place was something far stronger than paper rules. It was truth, and once truth found its way into the open, it could not be forced back into silence. Cashin leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and listened to the calm ripples of the lake. He whispered to himself that soon enough Letitia would make her final move, and when she did, everything would come to an end one way or another. The days after the meeting were filled with tension that could be felt in the air around Ashwood Lake. Neighbors walked past each other with quick greetings that carried more weight than words. Some smiled at Cashin Holt for the first time, while others whispered about what would happen next. The board had been broken in front of everyone, but Letitia Vorn had not surrendered. She stayed hidden in her home for several days before she reappeared in the community with a new plan. Her voice carried false confidence when she spoke to the people on the paths, claiming Cashin was lying, that his documents were tricks, and that he was trying to take their homes away. But her words did not hold the same strength they once did, and many only nodded politely without believing her. Still, her anger burned, and it pushed her toward a desperate choice. Cashin knew it was coming. He felt it in the air every evening as he sat on his porch watching the lake. He knew people like Letitia never gave up power willingly. They clung to it until the very end, even if it destroyed them. Soren Pike visited him, often bringing news from around the neighborhood. He told Cashin that Letitia had been speaking with lawyers from the county, and that Albin had been seen driving late at night, meeting strangers outside of town. Soren laughed at their desperation, but Cashin knew desperation made people dangerous. He kept his calm, but he began preparing in his own quiet way, gathering not only documents but also witnesses who could stand with him when the final strike came. It arrived on a warm Saturday morning when the sun shone brightly on the lake. Cashin heard the noise of cars pulling up and voices raised in authority. He walked out to see Letitia leading a group once again, but this time they were joined by men in suits who carried briefcases and a county deputy who looked uneasy about being there. Letitia announced loudly that Cashin was being evicted from the cabin for false ownership and violations of county code. The neighbors came out of their homes, drawn by the sound of her voice, until a large crowd had gathered along the path. She wanted an audience for this moment because she believed it was her chance to take back control. The deputy cleared his throat and explained that a complaint had been filed, but his tone suggested he was not convinced of its truth. Cashin stepped forward, calm as always, and asked to see the legal order for eviction. The men in suits shifted uncomfortably as they opened their briefcases and produced papers, but Cashin studied them carefully and shook his head. He told the deputy that these were civil filings, not court orders, and that no eviction could be enforced without due process. The deputy frowned and admitted Cashin was right. Murmurs spread through the crowd as neighbors began to realize Letitia was bluffing once again. Letitia's voice rose with fury as she accused Cashin of trickery, of corruption, of buying off officials. She screamed that he was a thief who wanted to own everything. Cashin let her words wash over him, and then he raised his folder of deeds once more. He showed the deputy the official seals, the signatures, the chain of ownership stretching back decades. Corin Marrow, the librarian, stepped out of the crowd and confirmed once again that these documents were real and matched the county records he had seen himself. The deputy looked at the papers, then at Letitia, and finally shook his head, saying there was nothing here that gave her authority. The crowd erupted with whispers and angry shouts. One man yelled that he had paid fines for years under false rules. A woman shouted that her backyard had been restricted for no reason. Others began demanding answers from Letitia, who stood trembling with rage, her eyes darting around the crowd. She looked at Albin for support, but he stepped back, clearly shaken by the weight of the truth. The men in suits quietly closed their briefcases and slipped away, knowing there was no case left to fight. Cashin's voice cut through the noise, calm and steady. He told the neighbors that he never wanted this fight, but he could no longer allow lies to stand. He reminded them that the lake and the land belonged not to rules made by fear, but to those who lived there with respect. He said he would not tear down their homes or destroy their lives, but he would no longer allow an HOA built on false authority to control them. He told them it was their choice whether to rebuild together with honesty or to let the past continue to chain them. For the first time, many of the neighbors spoke openly. They shouted that they were done with Letitia's board, that they wanted freedom from the endless rules and punishments. Some even cheered Cashin, calling him the man who had given them back their voice. Soren Pike laughed so hard tears ran down his face, shouting that the Queen of Fines had finally lost her crown. The crowd's energy grew until it was clear that Letitia's reign had ended. Letitia tried one last time, screaming that they would all regret this, that Cashin would ruin them. But her voice cracked and the crowd turned away from her. Even Albin walked off in silence, his tape measure hanging uselessly at his side. The younger board member who had once doubted her stepped forward and announced she was finished with the lies and would never serve on the board again. Letitia stood alone, her hands trembling, her face pale, before she finally stormed away into her house, slamming the door behind her. The neighbors turned to Cashin, waiting for what he would say next. He told them calmly that nothing would be forced upon them. He offered to work with anyone who wanted a fair system that protected the lake and respected the people, but he would never allow fear to rule again. His words were met with applause and relieved smiles. For the first time in years, the air around Ashwood Lake felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, the community began to change. The board dissolved and the neighbors started to gather on their own to discuss improvements and share ideas without the threat of fines. Gardens grew without strict measurements, docks were repaired without endless forms, and laughter returned to the quiet paths around the water. Cashin watched it all from his porch, never pushing himself into the center, but always present when someone came with a question or concern. He became less of a stranger and more of a quiet guardian whose patience had freed them. Letitia eventually sold her house and left, unable to live where her power had been broken. Albin disappeared quietly as well, though no one cared to ask where he went. The community did not miss them. Soren became louder than ever, hanging new wind chimes and joking that he was now the minister of noise at Ashwood Lake. His humor brought smiles even to those who had once been afraid. But deep inside he carried the memory of the struggle and the reminder that peace was not always given but often earned. And as long as he lived on the edge of Ashwood Lake, no one would ever again mistake false power for truth. The lake was calm once more, the neighbors were free, and Cashin Holt remained the silent figure at the center of it all, the landlord they had never expected, but the one who had given them back their home.